Our last speaker is Paul Ortiz.
Join me in welcoming. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Very good, very good. Thank you. It's very humbling. It's a great honor to be invited to be with such amazing comrades and friends. I want to begin by saying how deeply indebted I am to Dr. Cedric Robinson. The work Black Marxism was a work that changed my life and that changed so many people's lives. And I just want to thank him from the bottom of my heart. And to think that this work brings us together among the amazing works that people, not just in the panel, but everyone here in this room is doing to challenge, to confront racial capitalism in so many different ways. I'm going to do a bit of an unconventional presentation today. I'm not really going to talk as much about workers who are outside of the academy. I want to talk about my students and the challenges that they have in a state like Florida, a state of 20 million people, which in some ways is the tail wagging the American political dog right now, and the deep struggles that they have in trying to figure out who they are and dealing with the system. We don't have race relations in Florida. We have racism. Or I got an email from Karen Fields on the way over here, and I was just reminded the wonderful work in racecraft that Karen and Barbara Fields did. And it's just, when you're in a place like Florida, you're just reminded of this all the time. I gave out a lot of handouts. I'm the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and I want to talk about field work and the field work that our students are doing and putting them in contact with SNCC veterans, with veterans of the Chicano movement, but also the contemporary struggles for ethnic studies in places like Florida and Arizona. I wonder if this works. Can you all see that? Okay, very good. So part of this also comes out of a recent trip that I made to participate in the American Studies Association. We did a wonderful panel organized from one of my former students, Jonathan Gomez, who's now working at UC Santa Barbara. And we did this panel, James Baldwin, Chicano, it was called Chicanos and Latinos Read James Baldwin. And we were invited by people in East LA, teachers, to come out and do the panel in the community. Because it turns out that there's a lot of high school students in East Los Angeles who are reading James Baldwin. And so we were really excited to do that. We ended up doing a panel in Eastside Cafe, which those of you that know a lot about Chicano history know it has a very iconic place in Chicano history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And also, the book that I'm working on now that Jordan mentioned, it's coming out of Beacon Press, on our separate struggles are really one. I'm not going to talk too much about the book except at the very end. Now, like I said, I gave out a lot of handouts. There are two different case studies that I talk about in the book, and both of them involve African Americans who are critiquing racial capitalism, beginning in the 1850s, although that critique began much earlier, from a black abolitionist perspective, and white allies making that critique, connecting capitalism, although generally you don't use the term capitalism in the 1850s, but connecting the commodification of black labor and U.S. imperialism, the struggle against slavery. Also, Mexican abolitionists in Southern California were critiquing that system as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I wrap up. I do have also a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them very quickly. When I returned from Los Angeles and I talked to my students, I'm teaching a Latino diaspora class right now, I show them all these slides of murals from El Sereno and other parts of Los Angeles, and they say, where's our tradition? Where's our mural tradition? And I showed them what really bit was a mural that had a depiction of General Antonio Maceo, who's one of the great freedom fighters against the Spanish in the 1870s through 90s. And they said, we don't even have this in Miami, but we do have Miami Heat murals. And the question that they have is, how do we create or recover a tradition of struggle which has been stolen from us? And it is stolen from us in a basic level. Elizabeth began by talking about the critique of schools. Our schools steal our people's histories from us. I didn't grow up learning about this history. Who will teach it, if not us? Florida is a tough place to do, it's a tough place to grow up as a young person. This is the history of the state. It's an in-your-face kind of racist state. It's no different now in many ways, even after generations of struggle. And the dichotomies that people make between South Florida, Miami, Pensacola, and Jacksonville, there are very real differences between those places. But they're all places that are outposts, if you will, of racialized capitalism, of racism. It doesn't matter what part of the state that you're in. This was a slide, this is a picture, a photograph taken by Stetson Kennedy in 1947. And when I did this presentation in East Los Angeles, connecting James Baldwin with Chicano struggles, I juxtaposed these different quotes. Malcolm X talking about, we're not really welcome here. This system wasn't built for us. So how do we create a new system that will work? The United States, we built the country, but we didn't build it, or it wasn't built for us. That's kind of the basic theme. In Florida today, the police act with impunity. They act with maximum violence. This is a case that happened right on the campus of the University of Florida, where I teach. I'm a graduate student, an African student who was a PhD candidate in anthropology, who also had polio, was shot at point-blank range. And basically after he was shot and almost killed, in a hospital, helpless, the police charged him with assault on police. And we had to organize a long series of protests, our students did, and initially a lot of shock, but again, this is Florida, this is where we're at. So the police are allowed to just knock down your door, invade your space, and gun you down. And that's the kind of state we live in, that's the kind of country that we live in today. That cover that I showed earlier, those of you that are familiar with Southern history will recognize that cover, the photograph, the marker about African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans, was the cover of the Jim Crow Guide, which was published by Stetson Kennedy. And in the Proctor Oral History program, we had a special relationship with Stetson before he passed away. He did a number of interviews, a number of organizing workshops with our students. And I want to talk about some of those, not with him per se, but with other individuals who have spent a lot of time with our students and have helped them kind of get this kind of alternative people's history that they're not getting in the schools. This is a piece that I wrote about Stetson in trying to figure out his legacies in oral history. And again, I'm just going to go through these really quickly, and if folks want to copy this, I'm happy to give them a copy. But one of the things we do a lot is put our students in direct contact with freedom fighters from different movements. Today I'm going to talk mainly about what we're doing in getting our students out and doing oral history field work. In this particular case, Attorney John Dew, was a really important civil rights attorney. Our students spent a lot of time with him, not just interviewing him, but just kind of hanging out with him and dreaming about what could be, using his work in 1963 in Macomb, Mississippi, to talk about what's happening now in terms of voter denial in the state of Florida. Because if you follow the news, voter suppression. Florida is ground zero for voter suppression. This has led to a number of different research projects that our students are doing interviews in. I handed out a copy of, a couple of things. One is a compilation of a booklet that our students have put together after 7 years of field work. By the way, please keep all that material. I can't take it back home with me, so you can have it. It's free, courtesy of the Proctor program. But when our students are interviewing freedom fighters, veterans of the civil rights movement from SNCC, from CORE, from SCLC, and other social movements, they're learning so much. They get inspired, they get disturbed, they hear tragedies, they hear triumphs, and it's a kind of a people's history, and they hear a lot of people talking about confronting racial capitalism, which I'll get to in a moment. That project, going to the Mississippi Delta, and we've been going there for 7 years now and interviewing civil rights movement veterans, has led into other projects. One is the Latino Diaspora Project. We're going to be going to, we've had students on the ground doing oral history field work with people in the ethnic studies movement in Tucson, which those of you familiar with that know it's been banned recently. I argued a few years ago in a piece that the banning of ethnic studies in Tucson Unified School District is connected to the anti-immigrant movement, which is really a movement not simply to cheapen Latino labor, to keep us disenfranchised, but also to go further. To keep us disenfranchised, you have to tell us we have no history. We have nothing to look back to. Why would we demand citizenship or power in the society if we have no past, no heritage, no legacy? And so in that piece, I connected the labor repression of immigrant workers with the banning of ethnic studies. And our students are really, I think, bearing that out. When we take our students to the Delta, we stop off, and you have to think about, unfortunately, like Lonnie, I don't have any maps. I should have had a map which takes you from Gainesville up north, you take a left turn, and you drive through a town called Tallahassee, Florida. It's our state capital. It's a really tough town. One of the amazing people that we always stop to talk with is Mrs. Laura Dixie, and you can see our students just hanging out with her. We're having lunch. I mean, they're going to interview her at a certain point, but she's a person who's who's been tremendously impactful on our students. She's one of the last living organizers who was a rank-and-file organizer with the Tallahassee bus boycott in 1956. She was the founding president, as I point out here, of the AFSCME Hospital Workers Union. She used to have to carry a knife to work to defend herself from abusive white supervisors. So she's a person that our students really take to and are very inspired by. Two of the students that I'll talk about here, this is Naila Summers on your left and Caroline Vickers on your right. And the summer after they did this work, Naila became one of the co-founders of the Dream Defenders, which organized, of course, initially in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin. Caroline Vickers, on the other side, went to law school, and her focus now is really on social justice law at Howard. And so interacting and being with these freedom fighters has had a big impact on these students' lives. Brianne Palmer here. Brianne is Georgetown University, Georgetown Law, and the types of law you're encouraged to go into in South Florida, where most of my students are from, you're not encouraged to go into public interest law. You're not encouraged to go into any kind of advocacy for human rights or environment or anything like that. And so when they spend time doing this field work, it really does change their lives. And it's also very inspirational for the movement veterans to know that people are still open-minded, that there's a lot of problems in the society, and that young people are trying to figure out what's going on. So the interactions that are taking place are very important. And when we get to Mississippi, I mean, I can teach people certain things in a classroom. I can prepare them, maybe. I can give them things to read. I can give them lectures. I can play tapes in class. But when we get there and the field teams start doing their work, I step back. I mean, that's the time for me to just kind of fade into the background. And that's the time where their learning begins. A few years ago, we brought Lawrence Guillot, who you know is one of the co-founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and again, simply put him in contact with high school students in the Mississippi Delta and our students. He did a 2-hour organizing workshop with our students. It was just amazing. And it was all about, you know, we kept on asking him historical questions about life in the 60s and the MFDP, but he wanted to talk to us about now. You know, what are you doing now? What are the issues confronting you? What are the social problems you're dealing with in Florida? Sometimes the place is kind of speaks for itself. This is the Emmett Till Museum, what will become the Emmett Till Museum in Glendora, Mississippi. It was profoundly moving. It has always been profoundly moving for our students to talk to members of the Till family who still live in Glendora, a town of just a very few hundred people. And for them to be there and to participate, and then again for the people in Glendora to see these people from Florida coming year after year after year, you know, people begin linking struggles, linking stories, It is all about storytelling. If you don't share your stories with people, you can't build any kind of movement, any kind of struggle. We do a lot of organizing workshops in between the interviews. This is one with Gwendolyn Zohar Simmons. Those of you familiar with the history of SNCC know she was the project director for SNCC at Laurel, a very tough place in Mississippi for a year and a half. She's also a professor at the University of Florida, so it's really a tremendous thing to have her. I'm just going to tool through some really quickly here. This is Genesis Laura. She's working here, did an interview with Alan Cooper, and she's a student who's actually leading the Tucson field trip. Those of you who have this handout here, you'll see the field trip participants. You'll see that almost all of these are first-generation students of color, like Genesis. She's from the DR. And the impact of this trip on her, in part, is her coming back and saying, let's organize a field trip to Tucson. Let's figure out what's happening down there. Let's learn about what young people are doing in terms of struggle. This gets us to the East LA, the James Baldwin piece, which I can talk more about in Q&A. But essentially, it was connecting Baldwin with El Sereno now, and connecting Harlem. What I try to do is kind of ground with people around Harlem in the 1930s as a historian, what they're doing now, what they face in El Sereno, which obviously there's a lot of similarities in terms of over-policing, gang violence, the gentrification. You see the historical iconography here. Ruben Salazar, one of our great investigative journalists, gunned down by the LA Sheriff's Department. Again, it's a story that our students, I'm trying to teach our students in Florida as well. That's the interior of East Side Cafe. You actually see Donna Murch in the end, who drove us around one night with Matt Cedillo, and it was real fun. She's been doing a lot of work in Ferguson. And these are just interior shots. But again, I guess I want to conclude on this point that basically we read Baldwin today to help us grapple with these questions. How do we survive with dignity in a society that clearly was not made for us? Baldwin's critique of innocence, of American exceptionalism, the fight against U.S. imperialism, and economic justice struggles. And the last slide I'll kind of end on is, well, two real quick, is in the book African American and Latino Histories, what I'm doing is I'm talking about something Du Bois said that he referenced as the government of American banks. When Du Bois talked about imperialism, he tried to be as specific as possible. And so when he talked to the National Convention of the NAACP in 1928, he said, what we're grappling with here is the government of American banks and what it does to people in Nicaragua and Cuba and Haiti and the Philippines and the United States. And this is why we have to fight to get the ballot back. It's about fighting corruption. That's the world that my students and our students grow up in now, a very corrupt political world. No one wants to admit it's corrupt, but it is, and they know it, and they tell us. And so that's why I think Du Bois and Baldwin are so critical. And this is, if we were doing a classroom lecture, I would just give you notice I'm a teacher, some learning outcomes from our separate struggles are really one. But that's really kind of the gist of what I had to say. Again, please keep all these handouts. I actually have some tapes, some DVDs of some of the organizing workshops with Lawrence Guillot and some other folks. I have them up here. And please, I want to give them all out. I don't want to take them back with me to Florida. They might try to stop me at the state line. So please take them. And thank you so much for your patience.
If I could ask the panelists to come back up. And thank you. I think, each of these presentations kind of helps us, reframe the role of ideology and of culture in anti-racist social movements. And in different ways, they help us grasp, I think, the stakes in the struggle in language, in the arts, and in media over the meaning of events. So I wanted to just present a couple questions, then I'll open it up so we'll have about a half hour to engage as a whole. But in an interview Talani did a few years ago, she explained that being an artist is about listening. And I think we could probably extend that to say, being an oral historian, being a journalist, is about listening. And I wonder if you could, each of you could maybe talk about that in your respective work, particularly the critical importance, as Elizabeth was saying, to the voices and the visions of social movements, confronting torture, confronting state violence, confronting the kind of destruction of the networks that are created out of struggles themselves. So, yeah.
Can I defer it to Lani since it was her
Of course, sure.
Okay. As a journalist, I think for me, listening was critical. But I find in trying to do history that it's really critical for me to set meta-narratives aside and just look at the archive. I have what I call the 7 stations of the cross of Black history in my head from long ago, from decades. And what's in the archive suggests other things if you're not just looking for the 7 stations. So to me, it's a different kind of listening, or it's like looking with an open mind, and that was necessary. I came to this project because I was here at CUNY in 07, 08, doing a project on Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Alberta Hunter, and their connections. They have musical connections, but I really started to notice where they were performing, and it turned out to be all the places that were in my reading for my comprehensive exams on what happened after the Civil War. I was like, okay, this, like the Blues Trail in Mississippi that you can follow as a tourist now, is a much older communications network that also built the blues circuit. It built the Garvey chapters. It includes the places where the civil rights movement happened, but it was really built by building railroads after the Civil War. So for me, that's the kind of listening I do now. It's just like see what it's saying and then try to figure out what that means later. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in oral history, I was rereading a presentation that Karen Fields did at the Oral History Association many years ago. And for our students in Florida who are from Miami, who are part of a post-1959, if they're from the Cuban diaspora, they're trying to recover family histories, not just simply the history of the 10 Years' War, the histories of 1898, the struggle against racism in Cuba in the early 20th century. They're just simply trying to recover their own family genealogies that have been cut off from them for many different reasons. You know, Genesis Laura, I think about her because, I mean, she's not Cuban American. She's from the Dominican Republic, but the same types of silences, I mean, she grew up with the same types of silences about politics in the DR, the kind of the haunting experience of this amazing revolutionary movement in the early 1960s that collapses in large part because of the U.S. Military invasion. So what do you do with that? You know, you almost got there and it was crushed. There's a lot of fear, a lot of shame. And so for her, getting into oral histories and learning these stories of struggle in the African diaspora, I think really helped prepare her to come back her senior year, and she wrote a wonderful senior thesis on the revolutionary movement in the DR, including talking to her own family members who were part of that struggle. And I think that's one of the things I've learned a lot from Karen Fields in terms of, you know, why we do oral history. What Karen said in her presentation, I think it was in the mid-'80s, was that we need to understand the wisdom that's out there. And we need to relate to people. Of course, she was working on a history of her grandmother at the time, which became Lemon Swamp. That book is so important. It's important to return to that work. For me, I guess it's been very, very important. But getting our students, helping them, and just sometimes telling them, yes, validating, yes, go and look at your family history. It's important, it matters. especially in a place, people don't realize what a closed society a city like Miami can be. If you grow up in it, it's hard for me to explain it to you. These conversations that I have, I was talking to Dan Widener earlier, some of our students, Cuban-American students who worked in the Barack Obama campaign in 2008, I mean, for them it was a revolutionary activity. And I tried to explain to my friends in California and New York who were saying, well, you know, Barack Obama is going to sell out, all this. I said, no, you don't understand what it means, the tremendous hope and the fact that these students now are going to go on and become organizers in other struggles, which is what has happened.
I'm debating about this a little bit because I'm going to say something that maybe is not so nice always. But I think as a young woman, I listened because that was what was expected. I wasn't expected to speak so much. And in the early days of my relationship with Cedric, we'd go places, and somebody going to grad school was a big deal to me. I didn't know anybody that had gone to grad school. And we'd be around grad students. He was a grad student. And it was intimidating to me, so I listened perforce. And then at some point, I figured out that if I didn't say something, somebody else was going to say what I was thinking. And then there was a period where I'd say something, and somebody, we'd be in a little informal seminar, and somebody would say later, when Cedric said X, and I'd say, wait a minute, I said X. And so the listening was part of my learning. So that's one piece of it. The other, I think, is that I always enjoyed listening to old people from my family and elsewhere. And so I became, I think, a good listener. And now I've, of course, become an old person, so I'm... but it's those kinds of things which, if you're not listening carefully to people, you're missing so much. So it's necessary, as both of you say. And sometimes it's not obvious what it is they're trying to say. And if you're not listening carefully, it's really easy to get off at the wrong stop.
I used to be shocked when I came home with the tape and then listened to the tape after I'd interviewed somebody. One, they might be in a totally different mood than I thought I was getting by watching their face. They might be smiling, but the voice is totally hostile. And just listening to the tape later, I'm going, wow, he was in a bad mood. But you also aren't really, you have to listen over and over is what I'm saying. That's
We'll share this.
okay. Share mic. I'm not touching any more technology.
Also, if I could
go ahead.
just real quick, there's also a distinction with learning versus studying. And this is something we try to teach in oral history. Alessandro Protelli has told us over and over again. When our students go out, when we do field work, we're learning from people. We're not putting them under a microscope. And again, if we're talking about building social movements and linkages between different locations, that's fundamental. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is a gap between, oftentimes, movements on campuses, and maybe why in recent years the college campus, university campus, in many cases has been marginal to broader social movements. I find it to be very, very interesting because we're not really listening to what's happening,
Well, I have a lot more to ask, but more importantly, you probably do. So I'd like to open it up if I can. And we have a mic here. Because we're being live streamed, we'd ask you to come to the mic to ask questions, but I'll walk around with this as well. So who will be brave and step forward first? Danny, let me bring you a mic, though.
I don't want to step forward, but I can be brave. Set of circumstances present themselves. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank all of the panelists for really provocative comments. And the question I have, in listening, I was struck in that everybody spoke to a certain extent or another about multi-generational linkages within the context of particularly black self-activity in the South. And I'm trying to get a sense of whether or not the antagonism that I perceive in a more contemporary moment within the broadly defined black community around generational issues is new or not. I guess I don't want to presume that there weren't intergenerational conflicts at other moments. So I guess I want to hear people's thoughts about whether it's accurate to perceive a different level of communication and contact within generations today, and if that poses a problem for the kinds of organizing that people are speaking to, or if that's really an erroneous perception driven by my despair at the absence of an already existing mass social movement.
I'll speak to the freed people. Those ministers I showed traveling around Georgia, on average, they were speaking to 3,000 people at a time. They are speaking to entire communities. One of the beauties of the process of having meetings, what I call a kind of holistic participatory democracy that freed people engaged in or devised for themselves, was that anyone could speak, children and women included. Many military people, like in the coastal towns, tried to tell freed men that freed women need to stay home, not come to the meeting. That didn't really work out. So in meetings in Richmond, you have women testifying to sexual assault by the same military people, Union soldiers who are stationed in Richmond, being thrown in the jail, gang raped, things like that. So you are also having women articulate issues that are otherwise not shared in public arenas in the 1860s, otherwise in this country. You don't have women getting up and saying they were made concubines earlier in life. In a southern place, anybody in the room probably could guess who the person was who had, had this woman enslaved. So I think they started out with a different need to all be in the same room. The needs were so dire, and the needs were so all-encompassing, from food, clothing, shelter, to having to set up a group of sentries to stay outside their tent city, because Union soldiers came in there at night to steal blankets. So I feel like it's similar to what happened with the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Everybody had the same things at stake, so everybody had a voice. Did we change that in some way? Yes, I think we probably did.
I mean, just to echo what Dr. Davis is saying is that, it's important to understand, and you mentioned in your comments, how sophisticated African-American political cultures were in the wake of emancipation. And I rarely have ever seen works, on a few occasions at least, certainly your work, and others in this room certainly, where people really understand what that means. The theft of citizenship from an entire group of people couldn't help but have an impact on the ways in which those people communicate with each other over a period of time. And I think that's something that we haven't come to grips with. We certainly haven't come to grips with that in the broader political culture. What did it mean to steal people's citizenship, not just once, but even if you went back to the 1830s in the North, these newly enfranchised African Americans in the wake of the American Revolution, a relatively small number, but still the targets of disenfranchisement campaigns. And what would that mean for kind of an internal coherence or a sense of heritage? And so there are a lot of broken linkages there. I think it's important not to, on the one hand, over-romanticize the level of community that people had back in those days, but at the same time, it's important not to forget the levels that they did in fact have. I think we need to think about technology too, and how technology can sometimes, we have allowed sometimes technology to attenuate these ties of community. And we do little funny things like say, well, I don't know how to operate this new piece of equipment. A young person knows how to operate it, right? And which is often true, but at the same time, we've forgotten older ways of learning and wisdom that are quite important.
Really quickly, I don't want to get started on social media and things like this because I find it problematic in a lot of ways in terms of disconnects for people, and certainly generationally, that's one of the things that happened, but maybe for me, the least problematic part, because I think it's atomizing in a lot of ways. So I know some of you use it beautifully, but it does concern me in terms of the difference between coming to a place together and crossing distances via the web. So that's, I guess, one of my thoughts. And the other is just in terms of those histories, those family histories, and working with high school students, which I did for a while, I would try to get them to go home and ask their parents. They were mostly Latino kids. And I said, go and ask your mother or your father or your grandparents to tell you their story. It was virtually impossible for them at that age because they were, in some ways, going through teenage alienation from their parents or whatever, I guess. I don't know. But they were also, as first-generation kids, maybe embarrassed a little bit about that history of their families. I don't know what it was all about, but it was really difficult to get them to valorize those older generations at that point. Most of us don't really get there until it's too late to be able to talk to the people we want to talk to.
I just would add, though, I think for a lot of us in the room, multi-generational participation was enforced by patriarchy. So, I mean, you had to go, you had to be there. You didn't know you were being taught skills that you would use in life. I was doing voter registration at 11, not because I woke up one morning and said, I need to know how to register people to vote, even though I am too young to vote. But when I got to Columbia in the 60s, all of the black students there knew how to organize. So what did? We took over a building. And it was easy because we already had organizing skills. And my students now, they don't really have that experience with how to make their voices heard in a group. So I do, when I say I think, yes, we changed some things, there's something about that iron rule of patriarchy, and Sunday you put on your patent leather shoes and go to church, you will be going. That was operative. So.
One person here, and then we'll take two.
I'm a choreographer and I work with movement, and I wanted to say this because I thought somebody else would say it, so I thought about you. What comes to mind are a couple different things. Multi-generational dehumanizing and in technology. And I was working with a psychologist, and we were talking about technology and the nonverbal communication that goes on or doesn't go on. And then she talked to me about, well, what's really important that we don't really know is that a part of our human development, the things that make us human, is the nonverbal and being able to read that. And so when we talk about technology and a generation that is so addicted to technology, then we're talking about another generation that's being dehumanized, maybe. I don't know. But I see this because we don't do these physical things to read in between the lines because the words are, not as descriptive. So I just wanted to speak to that.
Thank you. I just actually want to ask a question that goes back to the theme of the panel, which is radical political imaginaries. Because, Elizabeth, you started making an interesting distinction between communication and information. I know what you mean by that, but and Tulani, I like the idea that we would replace the 7 stations of the cross with some kind of new circuits. And so I just wondered if people might say a little bit about what you see now as the most necessary or promising elements or possibilities for radical political imagination today.
I agree with you. I mean, I don't know how to move the way I used to when I was younger, certainly. I mean, just because there's so much that we do that's stationary. And just the gesture that you made in terms of talking about moving, it speaks in ways that I think we lose. I mean, I know that people post a lot of things, including old video and things like that of musicians that otherwise we wouldn't see, et cetera. But there's that coming together that I think is just really important. So I agree with you. In relation to Avery's question and my comment, communication versus information, to go back to the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, and all of that, or to go to NPR or PBS. I mean, the point is to distribute information to you, or to distribute culture or whatever. But there is not an understanding of it as a two-way or a multi-way conduit. That's information. Maybe a superhighway or a dirt road, I don't know. But communication implies exchanges. And those are the things that I think are critical in terms of being able to organize and imagine a way forward for me. In terms of what those ways forward are, I think for me, one of the first things is to heighten people's criticality of what they're consuming all the time. That's not enough, however, because some of us never learn how to stop criticizing and start doing something. But maybe it's because of people I've encountered just even in the last month. I am struck by the depth of the thought of some of the young people that I've encountered. Younger academicians, younger people who are outside the academy, et cetera. So it seems to me that in some ways we're at a cusp, and I don't know what to do beside encourage that, because I think it's become, more and more repressive, and, the repressiveness maybe is what will, necessitate action for people who either haven't been active or don't know exactly how to be active. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
I mean, how do you take on a corporation? How do you get a corporation to change its behavior? That seems to be a critical building block. If you're talking about confronting racial capitalism, we have to teach each other, well, how do we deal with these fundamental units of capitalism? Elizabeth mentioned earlier this new film, The Coalition of Immokalee Workers. We premiered that film in Gainesville just 2 nights ago. And the wonderful thing about that film is, Ava Longoria is great and everything, but she's not really the wonderful thing about the film. The wonderful thing about the film, it shows a fairly recent struggle, that is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers struggle, forcing corporations to change their behaviors. Again, it's not a revolutionary activity, but forcing them to pay a penny per pound more for tomatoes. Imagine that. The reason that's important is that it's had a real impact in the lives of workers in the tomato harvest. It could be the difference between earning $13,000 per year and $16,000 per year. That's an enormous difference for a person that works in migrant labor in South Florida. And the film shows the CIW's trajectory and what they borrowed from the United Farm Workers, what they took from that, the 60s struggles. It talks about racialized capitalism in agriculture. It never uses the term, but Eric Schlosser and others say, well, isn't this interesting that so many of these generations of workers have been people of color? And it's not the whole thing again, and it shows the anti kind of Taco Bell campaign, the McDonald's campaign, the Burger King campaign, and it's showing to an audience of people who begin to think, well, maybe it is possible to win a struggle, because it's happening. I think it's right. And radio has played it as, I just want to magnify again, or just kind of echo what you're saying, Elizabeth, about the importance of radio. People are rediscovering radio in part because of web-based radio, but also low-power stations play a key role in these movements.
I think one thing that's real important is to foster the use of the imagination. I work across a lot of genres, but one side of my brain actually feeds the other. Each interest really assists the other in either building structures or having new ideas. So I really feel like young people of any generation know how to reach their peers, and they know what their barriers are, what the barriers are for them. That's the place to begin. It's like when the incidents in Ferguson started unfolding and unfolding, I was like, where are the usual suspects? The people who are there now teaching nonviolent protests or whatever, the professionals, I even consider myself among them. And I saw some scholars I know who were giving interviews, but I know they were doing research on that community. That's why they were there. But it is really interesting to see how, given that you know what your barriers are and you know how to reach people who are your contemporaries or your neighbors, how do you begin from scratch? That community is not building dissent the way we would have done it or the way old folks know how to do it. They really had to figure out how to engage at a different point in what we might view as a normal process. They had to engage cynicism. They had to ask people, can you imagine a reason to keep going, to do something? What should that thing be to do? They had to deal with people who think voting's not important. So for me, it's like something very, very important that's going on, because it is speaking to us about communities who are not already prepped for organizing, and we have so many thousands of communities that are Ferguson, that it's really important for all of us to understand what's happening there, to learn something from it, to amplify it where we are, and also to see, isn't this how it always is? Did Friedman know anything about organizing mass rallies and making sure there were 200 guys with rifles on the peripheries? No, they had to learn it the hard way. So for me, if we look at our roots in people who were the most incredibly mobilized generation we've ever had, even including the 60s, freed people, mobilized people in 11 states for a sustained period of time, 10 years. They could get a crowd out for whatever it was. They got a crowd out for Souls to the Polls, where people were going to get shot for exercising the vote. So for me, we have not had generations of people who were prepared and taught organizing, but people who learned to improvise. So for me, it's like to strengthen young people to have faith in their imagination, the connections they make between things that we might not get off on first hearing, and also then to share whatever wisdom the elders have, but after the elders have been listening. Because I really do think we are relearning communicating. When we stop listening and get ready to talk, we have to be relearning that. So there's a young man sitting here who saw a couple of my maps and said, could you make the captions bigger? And I was like, yes, I could do that. Because I could make the maps an experience by themselves. So I think I didn't know exactly what it meant to him, but it didn't matter, because I'm trying to learn to communicate. So yeah, I think fostering the thing we don't understand, human imagination, helps.
Hi. I'm really struggling with what it means to be a black, what is a black radical tradition today, primarily in terms of how most folks, just within the black community even, let alone outside of it, would see or would think of the notion of a black radical tradition. I think we've gotten to the point where wearing a button and attending a march could easily be perceived as being a black radical, and that button might simply say, hands up, and the march might simply be, simply, quote unquote, be against police abuse and for a civilian review board. And that notion is radical in many people, simply because one is standing up and organizing and protesting and calling for the end to something which is just so extreme. But as we know, that's not fundamentally radical. And I mean, yes and no. It is in the sense that in a place like Ferguson, it's the first time folks are organizing and just the process itself in a long time. But I'm very curious with the very unique historians who are here today to hear what you're finding, if you're doing contemporary research, among the folk, not just among the institutional sort of elite that we talk about, but the unique historical work that you do in churches, in civic groups, in youth groups. Are black folks talking about something that is deeper than just the right to stay alive and not be imprisoned? Is there a connection, not just superficially, but a connection, a critique and a plan of action linking to the deeper issues? Because it seems like there is just such a absence of that deeper critique and the linkages of those issues. So I just wonder what folks are finding.
Let me take one more question and then.
Okay. Thank you all for your work. As you guys were speaking, and Paul, you kind of answered this already, I started to think about the connection of oral histories and emancipation at the present. So I come from this town called Oxnard, California. It's 60 miles north of LA. And so, they've been deporting 20 to 30,000, Latino Mexicans, whatever you call it yourselves, for the last 2 years. And so we've been getting stories from people in my community, and it's, I really connect it to modern day convict leasing, right? Because they're being shipped to Tacoma. There's 30,000 people that are working in these. And so my question is how do we create, and this is just a radical Chicano imagination, right? Where we have this instant oral histories that are able to be created to bring attention to this massive oppression that's been taking place.
Well, I think these two questions are linked together. The critique is there, and when you think about a group like the Dream Defenders in Florida, which self-consciously identifies itself as a black and brown organization of people in struggle, and they have been in close contact with people involved in the Dream activist movements in the West Coast, and there are these deeper critiques of injustice, people connecting the disenfranchisement of 12 million so-called undocumented people today with Jim Crow, kind of classical Jim Crow. So these deeper radical critiques are everywhere. In fact, I almost say they're pervasive. Can people act on them, though? That's the question. In Tallahassee, many of you remember just a couple summers ago, the Dream Defenders, this is the first time that our governor was actually driven out of the Capitol. Once those students sat in the state Capitol in Tallahassee, all of a sudden our Tea Party governor became a world traveler. He was terrified. He not only left Tallahassee, he left the state of Florida, because you had this group of students who sat in and they just wouldn't leave. They did have some elders come and say, "You've done a really good job. You're here for a day. You made your point. Now let us take over." They were very respectful. They said, "Thank you for your input, wise elder from the 1960s, but we're going to stay." And so I think that these critiques are everywhere. The thing we have to understand, though, is how, I want to return to this question of corruption. We live in a pervasively corrupt political and economic society where corruption is, kind of borrow an old Graham Parker song, it's from the bottom to the top. And we have to understand that the young people coming up now, kids, I can remember, I guess, my first awareness of this was in 4th grade. I thought, wow, what? But I grew up in a military town. I grew up in a shipyard town. So the advantage that we had was knowing right away that we were the ones who were kind of the soldiers of empire, that we would always be sent out. 3 generations of Ortiz men, we all ended up in the military. We all ended up in these weird kind of foreign imperial projects. It doesn't always, though, lead to political action if you have a radical, even if you have an understanding about what's happening and how corrupt your society is, it can lead to cynicism. It can lead to despair. And how do we work away from that is a question.
I think you're right to stay alive, to walk down a street in the city without being shot by a policeman doesn't require a lot of analysis, and it is a radical thought in a sense that you should be able to walk down the street. I do think it is part of what has always mobilized people, something that's very easy to understand. Do you have a right to survive in this culture? And so maybe what we're saying is someone providing or introducing us to an additional analysis about how to contend with that? And there, I think Black radical tradition is a conundrum. Is it a set of conventions from the past, or does it have life? I think that's what you're asking, right? Does it have applicability right now and a pulse? And I think yes and no. I think part of our problem is the atomization you're talking about. In some senses, in the digital age, when it's very easy to communicate with 100,000 people at once, it's really hard to have a conversation among 2 people. And that one thing I've been hearing today is being in the same room with somebody. I do think whenever people say, we need to have a conversation in the culture about that, it's an announcement that it's never going to happen. So it's like we do need to be in rooms where there's dialogue, and a lot of them are gone. So a lot of the venues for work where Black people worked and possibly might have joined a union, those are gone. Those factories in Fort Greene, they're gone. So there are people who are in a room together in that neighborhood when they go to vote. But what happens before then? Are they in a room together having this discussion? What's their analysis of the condition right now? So I think a lot of the institutions that we had are very challenged right now. And I would say really we need to think about, I'm a theater person, and I know incredible things happen to people's minds if they're in a dark room watching something together. Total enemies can be in the same room, and if they have the impression that all sides will be spoken for on that stage while the lights are out, they're fine with that. We know how to do that in this culture. We know how to have that conversation. So I think more rooms, more situations for us humans to feel what people are saying when they talk about the suffering they would like to work against.
So Elizabeth, and then we have time for one more question from Ravin.
I will try to be short because I'm not going to answer what the Black radical tradition is. Hang around for a couple days. I'm sure there will be some answers for that. The only thing that I would say is, following on what Paul was saying, I'm sure that the Black radical tradition is a much broader frame than it was 30 years ago. Black and brown and various other ethnic groups, whether we call them people of color or whatever, there is a different frame, and I think that immediately allows for some different possibilities. The oral history, I think, is really important, and getting to it is not always easy because of the kinds of barriers that Daniel was asking about earlier. But I'm also want to say that we have to really be clear that we're not going to look inside the academy for all of this. And for example, I've been working a little bit with a Mistec group in Oxnard who have gotten a low-power radio license for themselves, who have been alienated from the Latino community or the Chicano community, the Mexicano-Chicano community, who are contemptuous of them as Oaxaquitos, little people, little brown people. But they know why they want a radio station, and they know why having radio in their language rather than in a colonial language, be it English or Spanish, is important. So those little pockets of, I don't know, recognition, whatever, I think are really important. And that's something to look for.
I'll try to be brief. So much. This is a wonderful panel. What I want to do is I want to actually invoke Cedric and then connect his ideas to all three talks and to the question about what a black radical, in fact, to even Avery's question about networks. One of the things that Cedric taught me, at least, in Black Marxism, is that C.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and all these others had to discover this thing called the Black radical tradition because it's not self-evident. In fact, it took deep, deep archaeological work to even make it visible. And so here we are living in a moment where we sometimes treat it as if it's self-evident, like where is it? And what's great about all three talks and all your work, I mean, Elizabeth, you basically are discovering those voices. I mean, the voices that are so important are the ones we don't know, and make them visible. Thulani, your work is extraordinary because you've completely revised the way we think about political organizing in the Reconstruction era, where it's not about just local, nor is it about people testing the waters of freedom by just roaming around, but instead establishing institutions that go even beyond the black towns. And so what you discovered were the existence of organized structures and mass movements that, Du Bois hinted at. He knew they existed. Stephen Hahn knew they existed. But you're finding them and their linkages to each other. And in Paul's work, so amazing, the kind of research he did on Florida and the levels of violence and levels of opposition to that, we didn't know that. So my whole point is that we don't know. And if you talk about Ferguson, it's interesting because Ferguson is part of St. Louis, which is part of a really well-organized, amazing place where people like Jamala Rogers and Organizational Black Struggle have been there for 40 years. And so we sometimes think, oh, well, this is new. And it appears new because it appears that way. Even among Lost Voices, among even the young people, many of them have organized, but in other ways that are not so visible. The Crips and the Bloods, they're organized, and they're out there as part of Lost Voices. Hands Up United, these are people who are young, but have sort of traditions and histories and relationships because, to go back to Cedric again, their opposition sometimes is not legible to us because they don't operate in the logic structured by capital, And so if that's the case, then we actually have a lot of work to do to try to determine what, not where do we go from here, but just what is actually existing already that's there in formation that many of us are alienated from, that don't appear to be structured by the logic of capital, and yet offer sometimes the sharpest critique of it. And so I just want to thank all of you for that work because you keep reminding us why scholarship, research, analysis, being on the ground, organizing, all this stuff matters because nothing is self-evident. I guess that's just my own.
I think that's a beautiful place to end the panel. Thanks again, and maybe join me in thanking our panel once more.